Hello my friends and welcome once again to 7 real scary stories from Reddit. There's nothing like a good scary story to force us to keep all of our lights on at night. But is it even scarier when it's real? Here's 7 true scary stories from real Reddit users. A few years ago, there was a small plane accident that occurred in a neighboring town. I was part of the county volunteer search and rescue group, and when we got the call, I was one of the responders to help try and see if there was any chance of a survivor from the crash. We found out from the sheriff that it was an elderly couple and their young granddaughter that were in this plane. Immediately, it went dead silent. You could see the life drain from the other responders' faces as soon as it was said. Upon getting to the area that the crash happened at, it was clear that there would be no survivors from this accident. It wouldn't have a happy ending. There would be no joyful and tear-filled reunion. This plane was absolutely destroyed. Our lead turned to the group and said, if anybody was uncomfortable or not willing to do the recovery of the bodies, there would be no hard feelings or anything held against them. Some people just aren't cut out for this. About half the group said that they wouldn't or couldn't do it. They helped set up the rappelling lines, made some radio calls to the other teams that were lower on the hillside, helping us navigate through the broken trees and aircraft parts to get to where we expected to find the bodies. I'll never forget that feeling of complete and utter numbness I experienced that day. The first thing any of us saw was this small stuffed teddy bear and the blood that had soaked into it. When we were finally able to get down to the bodies, we had to stop and collect ourselves. It was heartbreaking to see this little girl with such empty, devoid eyes. She was gone, never to grow up and experience life like most of us had, never to know the joys, aches, frustrations, sadness, excitement, and everything else life throws at you. I've seen a lot in my few years as an EMT. I've seen drug overdoses, diabetic shock, car crashes, suicides of all manners. But this messed me up for quite a while. Nobody should have to go through what we went through to help bring closure to the family. Nobody should have to deal with bringing back a child in a body bag. But if I don't stand up and do it, someone else has to bear the heartache, the depression, and the numbness. And I don't ever want someone else to experience it like I did. This will get buried, but oh well. When I was about 4, my dad was a mechanic and found an ugly little dog in the junkyard. He brought him home when my parents were going to take him to a shelter, but I begged and begged to keep him. I even swore I'd watch him since we lived in the middle of nowhere in the plains of the Panhandle in Texas. Anyway, they let me keep him, mainly I think because they didn't think he'd survive. Fast forward 5 years and the dog grows up to be the most beautiful big dog you've ever seen, named Ernie after Sesame Street. By this point, I was allowed to drive the golf cart to my grandparents' house about 2 miles away after school. The distance was pretty much just a big field with a few fences. One day, the battery went dead in the golf cart halfway there. Ernie had followed me like always, and we started walking the difference. All of a sudden, Ernie turns towards me and starts growling. This was a massive dog, and I was terrified. I had just seen Old Yeller too, and I was convinced he had rabies. I tried to run past him, and he jumped on me before I made 2 steps. He knocked me down. He stopped growling and just stood on top of me for a minute. When he got off, I started running towards my house. He just stayed there, growling at something imaginary. I told my dad and he grabbed his gun, presumably to kill Ernie, and I was freaking out. Like an hour later, I heard a gunshot. Imagine my surprise when Dad and Ernie came back unharmed. Apparently, there had been a nest of huge rattlesnakes in the ditch ahead of me, and Ernie had kept me from walking right through it. I'd never noticed it because I usually drove over the other side where the trail was. According to my very freaked out dad, there's no way I would have missed them. Ernie must have heard them and saved me. This is a story that happened to my dad. Now, my dad has never been one to make up a story like this before, and he can't even tell the story without getting goosebumps. It happened about 6 months ago, when my parents were on vacation at a friend's beach house. Our friends always told us about the place next door and that it had 5 new owners over the past 3 years they had owned the place. The last guy who lived there actually committed suicide about 3 weeks before this, but we don't know why. My parents just arrived there for the night. Everything's fine all day until they're getting ready for bed. My dad starts to smell a gas. Turns out the pilot light went out. so he goes outside to turn off the gas. When he's outside, he started to get the chills, and the entire time he's outside, he feels nervous. Once he finds the shutoff, he hears someone say, "What are you doing?" The voice is so real and pronounced that he actually responds with, "Shutting off the gas." He then realized what he just did and froze. He looks around and he didn't see anyone. Thought it was my mother at first, but after freaking out and running inside, she was in the bathroom brushing her teeth. My dad couldn't sleep at all that night. They ended up driving home at 3 a.m. They told our friends, the owners of the house, and they looked mortified. They told us that the guy who committed suicide not too long ago did so by gassing himself in the house. My dad can't tell this story without getting goosebumps. I don't think I've ever seen my dad legitimately that scared in his entire life. Could be a fake story, but the fear he gets in his eyes when he told me the story for the first time, I don't think you can fake that. My mother told me this story. Keep in mind my mother is a staunch Christian, does not believe in ghosts or anything of that matter, but she believes this as she was there and she has no idea what to think of it. My grandmother's grandmother, Florence, suffered from dementia in her older years, so badly that when her dog Fluffy died, she had it cremated and placed the ashes on the mantle. When my mother came to visit her grandmother, she would make Mom say hi to Fluffy by shaking the urn of the ashes. Yeah, great-grandmom was nuts. Well, my mother's Aunt Lucy, daughter of Florence, died suddenly. When she died, her siblings decided not to tell Florence about the death until after the funeral, due to her already fragile mental state. They had handled the funeral arrangements and everything, and even bought a new dress for Lucy to be buried in. The day after the funeral came, they told her that Lucy had died. Before they had the chance to explain, Grandma Florence asked them for help. Lucy had come by yesterday and was upset, Grandma Florence told them, that Lucy kept saying, "They're looking at me. I don't like them looking at me. I told you I didn't want them looking at me." See, Aunt Lucy's funeral had been an open casket. Apparently, Aunt Lucy had said previously that she didn't like open caskets and didn't want one for herself just in case. They were obviously shaken up to hear this impossibility and tried to reason with Grandma Florence and explain this wasn't possible as Lucy was dead. Dead? No, she can't be. She was just here. She was wearing the oddest dress, though. I've never seen it before. Grandma Florence then went on to explain the funeral dress that she had never seen in person, in perfect detail. My mom and I were on a walk around the neighborhood when I was in high school. It was summer and there were a ton of frogs making noise trying to mate. However, in front of one of the houses, we hear what sounds like a human screaming for help. It kept going, like a video playing the same 3-second clip of a woman screaming over and over. We shrugged it off initially as that neighbor left the TV on a lot, but we felt really weird about it for the rest of the walk. When we came back by the house, we could still hear the noise. Some of the other neighbors had the house key to his place. The owner was an old widower, and they went by from time to time to do housework and stuff that he had difficulty with. We went over there and told them what we heard and that it seemed kind of weird, but it's probably nothing. They agreed to go check on him since they hadn't heard from him in a few days anyway. Poor old man died 2 weeks prior. The neighbor didn't hear any sounds besides the frogs. Still gives me the creeps to this day. My dad and auntie have told me this story on separate events, and both accounts were the same. When my dad was about 16 in the late 70s, he and my auntie were waiting in my grandparents' waiting room at the front of the house just outside my grandparents' bedroom where my great-grandfather lay dying. The room had 3 exits, one that leads to my grandparents' bedroom, one that leads to the rest of the house, and the door that leads to the front gate. And there was no breeze at all, especially from anywhere in the house. My auntie felt cold, so she got up to close and lock the previously ajar wooden door and sat down. About 3 minutes later, my grandmother let out a wail as my great-grandfather had died at that exact moment. As both my auntie and father testify, the sturdy wooden door flew open and swung outwards as it slammed shut as if someone stormed out of the house angrily. It couldn't have been the wind, as the way the door opened and closed was exactly how an enraged person would slam a door. I've asked them separately, and they both gave me the exact same details. I'll post this once more, because I'll always remember this guy. I got lost on the bad side of town many years ago, and stopped at a Circle K to ask for directions. One of the guys standing outside to the store came up to my window and said, "Hey, I'm going that way anyway. I can show you how to get there." And me, being the idiot 18-year-old female that I was, said, "Sure." About 3 miles into the journey, the guy turns to me and says, "By now, I could have raped and killed you. I'm only telling you this because it happened to my sister 2 years ago. You seem like a really nice girl, and I would hate to hear that something bad had happened to you. Sorry to scare you, but if it saves your life, then I've done my job. You can let me out here." A similar thing happened my first day on a door-to-door sales job. A guy told me to come into his house so he could get his checkbook, and once again, idiot 18-year-old me went in. He went through a similar spiel. Don't ever go into someone's house that you don't know. It's really quite amazing that I even made it to my age, now that I think of it. All of these stories were taken from a thread on Reddit. If you want to check them out, the link is in the description below. That's all the time I have for today, my friends. I hope you're having a wonderful day or evening. I'm Imori. Now listen to the spooky tunes.